The Detroit Regional Chamber's MPC20 Conversations Respond and Rebuild digital series is provided in partnership with Detroit Public Television and presented by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, with additional support from Accenture, Bank of America, Barton Mallow, Comerica Bank, Consumers Energy, Delta Dental, Dow, DTE Energy, Enbridge Energy, Ford Motor Company, Huntington Bank, ITC, KPMG, the Kresge Foundation, Kroger, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, PNC Bank, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, the Skillman Foundation, and TCF Bank. And by these supporters. Support for Detroit Public TV's coverage is provided by DTE Energy Foundation and Masco.
Sometimes when I read fiction books and my mom starts calling me, I just don't hear her and I keep reading. She'll come upstairs while I'm reading and tap me on my back and I'll still keep reading.
Hello, and welcome to MPC20 Conversations, Respond and Rebuild. This digital series, hosted by the Detroit Regional Chamber, is bringing smart dialogue focused on the unprecedented challenges that Michiganders are facing today. On behalf of the Chamber, I would like to thank Detroit Public Television and the many longtime corporate and philanthropic partners for bringing the spirit of our annual Mackinac Policy Conference to us virtually throughout the fall. Without their support of the Chamber, these discussions would not be possible. While an in-person Mackinac Policy Conference was not possible this year, ongoing dialogue among business, government, and civic leaders focused on moving Michigan forward remains critical as we work together to rebuild our economy. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and thank you for tuning in.
Good afternoon. My name is Tonya Allen, and I'm the president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation. Today's session is on education and the inequities that exist in our education system. Michigan students are bright and capable, all 1.5 million of them. Yet our state's educational system does not do them any favors. We don't provide the appropriate supports or advantages for them to be successful in school and to be competitive with the peers in their state, in our state, and our peers across the country. This is exacerbated and explicit during the COVID pandemic, but it was true before the pandemic. Many of us search for a silver bullet or a panacea to solve this problem, but there is no one cause for the challenges we see, nor is there just one solution. It is time for us to pull together if we're really going to address our challenges and our woes. We need every one of us, education administrators and labor, businesses, large corporations and small businesses, community, nonprofits and philanthropy, and our parents and students to pull together because our fates are intertwined. This is especially true considering the demographics of our state is graying. We're getting older. Therefore, if we are going to stay competitive as a state, this means we need to equip every student in the state so that they are capable of contributing to our economy and to citizenship. Our children aren't faring well in school, and there's no better indicator than third grade reading that tells us that how our school system is doing and how our students are faring. 53% of white students are reading at grade level in third grade. Consider that only half of white students in our states are reading at grade level. Now, it becomes even more devastating when we consider that only 20% of African American students are reading at grade level. third grade. That's right, 1 in 5. And this type of gap is just not limited to third grade reading. And it's not limited to Black or white students. It includes children who live in rural areas and urban areas, children with special needs, and children who are learning English for the first time. It includes 8th grade math scores, high school graduation rates and statistics, as well as whether or not our young people are completing college or trade certification. To solve this myriad of problems, it's going to require all of us to take a customized approach to our students. The School Finance Research Collaborative found that it costs 35% more to educate a child from a low resource neighborhood where the large majority of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous students live. A report from the Education Law Center gave Michigan a D for how well it targets funding districts in low resource communities. And the Education Trust found that Michigan is one of 15 states that doesn't provide additional funds for students in low resource communities. These inequities extend to our after school time as well. By 6th grade, children of middle class families spend more than 4,000 hours in after school and summer activities than their low income peers. This data is pre-pandemic, but we know that the inequities have even deepened during this time period. Black students and all of our children living in neighborhoods with fewer resources will lose ground this year, next year, and into the future unless we, our state, all of us step up to solve this problem. So today's panel is really focused on moving beyond the theoretical and getting to the real action that will allow Michigan to take and advance education equity. Here with me are 3 leaders who have led efforts here and across the country to improve conditions and outcomes for young people. First, we'll have Dr. John Powell, who is the director of Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley School of Law. He's also a native Detroiter. Mark Rosenbaum, who is the director of Public Counsel Opportunity Under Law, which aims to eliminate economic and education justice, and recently brought forward the landmark case on K-12 public education in our state. And Dannah Wilson, who is a junior at University of Michigan and a Detroit native, who's committed her life to improving education equity. And I also like to say that Dannah is the first ever youth panelist on the main stage of the Mackinac Policy Conference. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you join us today. So, John, we're going to start with you. Everyone's talking about education equity, but for some reason, I have this sneaky feeling that we're not talking about the same thing. Can you tell us about equity and what does it mean when we think about how we approach equity in terms of inputs as well as outputs?
Well, thank you, Tonya. And it's a delight to be in your company as always. It would be better to see you in person. It's also good to be in the presence of Mark and to meet Dannah. So equity in the context of education is oftentimes focused on inputs. It's focused oftentimes in terms of funding. And so it's, in that sense, it's fairly narrow. A more expansive approach would be to say, let's focus on outputs. And there are other frames that we use to talk about outputs. We talk about adequacy, we talk about an efficient education. And I think the outputs in some ways is really the gold standard. We're not simply concerned with what goes into education. We're concerned with what comes out. We're concerned, can the students read? Can the students function in society? And if not, there may be a need for more funding. There may be a need for different teachers. There may be a need to restructure the system. So when you focus on outputs, you're agnostic about what the inputs are. You say, whatever they are, the state has an obligation within reason to try to make sure that happens. And that's not happening. And the work of Mark and others around the country have been addressing that. And that's what's really exciting about not only the lawsuit, but the effort to actually think about what do we really need to do? What's getting in the way of making sure that every student can be a productive citizen and earn a living when they get out of school.
Thank you. And so, Mark, you have been doing exactly what John just communicated. you've been focusing on how to help the state get to delivering the appropriate outputs when you brought and represented the right to literacy lawsuit on behalf of 7 students in Detroit. Can you just tell us a little bit about this effort to assert that literacy is a constitutional right? Can you talk a little bit about what you were hoping to have come out of that lawsuit and what you found with your work in Detroit?
Well, certainly. Also, thank you for having me and having me as part of this very impressive panel. When you step back for a moment and you think that in 2016, when we brought the case, we were arguing that as part of the United States Constitution, all students should get a fair shot at an education in order to be meaningful participants in their democracy and in order to better their circumstances. What we found in Detroit, and we could have gone to other communities in Michigan, as you well know, were that students were attending schools that were schools in name only, where they didn't have access to qualified teachers in all their classes, where they didn't even have books. I never met a student in Detroit who had a book to take home for homework. I met students who had an 8th grader as their teacher and sometimes sat in vacant classrooms. I met students who had to compete with rats and vermin for space in their classrooms, temperatures that were below freezing or above 90 and 100 degrees. What that means, what the stake is in a case like that, is to say that all children have a right not to have their government subordinate them, attempt to disenfranchise them, because that's what education is ultimately all about. And the numbers that you gave, Tonya, if anything, understate the problem in Michigan. According to EdWeek, Michigan gets a D+ when it comes to academic achievement. It is the lowest state in the nation when it comes to improvement in education. And as you pointed out, that is pre-COVID, where we now expect that the achievement or the opportunity gaps are going to increase between somewhere to 15 to 20% and dropout rates to increase maybe as much as 10%. So we're really talking about the moral, the constitutional, the social, and economic viability of the state when it comes to its most precious resource, its children.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And one of the things that I appreciate so much about that lawsuit was the courage of the young people to decide that they were not going to allow this to happen to themselves, nor were they going to allow it to happen for the generations that came behind them. And Dannah, you too have kind of stood in the gap for others on this issue. Recently, a few years ago, you gave testimony on the appointment of Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. Can you talk a little bit about what lessons you learned from being an advocate for education?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm honored. But yeah, so in that process, first, I had no idea what I was getting into. No idea. I did not know, writing that speech, preparing for that speech, that it would reach 10 million views. But following that, so the goal did not get reached, which was that she would not be nominated. So that was a lot to deal with and grapple with when I came back, because that was my only goal, and I had to, for myself and also for the group that I went with, 42 Forward, had to redefine what it meant for me, like victory in doing this work, and making sure that we still celebrated the small wins, even though we couldn't like grapple and couldn't like attack a really stubborn system with one speech, which like in my mind was the goal. You know, my mother was just like, Dannah, that might not happen. I'm like, no, it's gonna happen. And that and so that was really, really hard to deal with, that disappointment, but it also built community with the group that I went with, and it helped me realize just like, what am I doing? What am I getting into? And it was a really helpful experience to experience it prior to college, so I can know, like, entering the University of Michigan, what type of advocacy did I want to do? It made it really, really personal for me. And it made me be able to teach in different ways and also learn in different ways. It also gave me a personal platform that made me like really a representative of my peers in my community. And I wasn't aware of that would happen either, but being that representative and also just being able to listen, take back, recognize my own privilege, and having that platform was really helpful.
Thank you for that, Dannah. John, when she was talking about this, it made me think about your work. So you are internationally known for your work on equity. And it makes your work and the way you approach this work, you make the words, you just help us understand it in such a concrete way. And it makes me think about Brian Stevenson, who talks about repairing. What does it take to repair a system? And that you do things differently, as you talked about just in your first answer. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just paint a picture for us about what's possible if we were to do things different? What are the kinds of things we should expect or would want to see in our education system for us in order for our state to be successful as well as the nation?
That's a great question, Tonya. So, and I think it's critical if we are going to thrive as a nation and if Michigan is going to thrive. And one of the things that's very interesting about the suit and about the effort is it didn't just look at the gap between Blacks and white students or between students of color and white students. As you laid out in your remarks at the beginning, white students aren't doing so well either. And so actually it shifts our focus in a way, because most of the way people think about equity, they only think about the gap. Let's close the gap. And that's not unimportant, but you can close the gap between white students and Black students. So if white students have reading proficiency of 50% and Black students have 20%, so does everybody come to 38%? Is that the goal? No, that's not the goal. So part of the thing that we talk about is to state what the goal is. We sometimes refer to that as targeted universalism, that we have a universal target, but the way you achieve that target has to shift from one group to the other because they're situated differently. So you don't have universal strategies, you have universal goals. In this case, that all students, all children can learn to read and perform as students, as citizens, and as workers. Then that's critical for Michigan and the country. And we've seen successes. This is not impossible, but it takes real commitment. And I know we're talking to part of the Mackinac Island group. And so the business community can play a special role. So there's a research triangle, which is Raleigh, North Carolina. It's more PhDs than any other region in the country. That's even more than my region, which I live in Berkeley, which does pretty well itself. But years ago, the schools were not performing well, especially Black students. And there was an effort to have a referendum. It failed. And then some people went to the legislators and said, well, okay, we failed at the referendum, but we need to rethink our schools. We need to remodel our schools so that every student has a fair shot, as Mark described. The legislators said, no, we're not messing with our schools. They're working for a small group of students, and those are the students that we are most concerned about. Then something interesting happened. The business community, not the voters, not the legislators, the business community stepped up in the research triangle, and they said, look, we can't continue to be one of the research powerhouses of the world unless we have an educated students coming out of North Carolina, coming out of this area. And if you are not willing to fix that, we're out of here. So the legislators actually changed the system, and it was outcome oriented. They didn't know exactly how to do it. But what they did, they said, no student will go to a school where more than 40% of the students are receiving eligible for free and reduced lunch. No student will go to school where more than 25% of the students are performing below on statewide tests. And they had 2 or 3 other metrics. The result of that, the Black students actually increased their proficiency by 50% within a very short period of time. I think for Latinos, it was 25%, and for white students, it was 5%. Everybody went up. But the thing to realize, this was pushed by the business community because they realized they had a vested interest in having students be better educated. That system is still in place. It's been under attack at different times. It's still in place. And it's not perfect by any means, but it's one of the best systems in the country. It's not a school, it's not a city, it's the whole region. So I think we know Detroit's a very poor city, one of the poorest cities in the United States, but the region is not a poor region. So one of the things is, can we look at the entire region, the resources of the entire regions, and indeed of the entire state? I think if it, and this is not about pitting one group against the other, this is about doing something for all students.
That's right. Well, I think the big point of all of this is that we have a shared fate. And if we don't come to realization of that, then we all will be harmed. So I really appreciate you bringing that such clarity to that question, John. Mark, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you see this question of equity in light of all of the kind of racial justice conversations and the racial reckoning that our country is wrestling with. There's a lot of talk about being anti-racist, which is about being purposely against racism, not just not being racist. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about whether or not how these things interplay with each other, if they support or conflict. Can you talk a little bit about that to help people understand and navigate all of the discussions that they're hearing about these topics?
Well, I love that question. If we were just talking economically, we would say, look, the stakes are high. If Michigan were in the middle of the country, it would mean for the current cohort of students, $27 billion more in terms of lifetime earnings. But you're exactly right. When you see the sorts of educational opportunities that are being denied to these young people with those sorts of economic consequences being surrendered, you know something else is going on. You talked at the when you introduced our student here, you talked about the bravery of students. This wasn't a victory of lawyers, it was a victory of community, and it was brave, courageous, strong students who said, we want to learn and we're not getting that opportunity. It shouldn't just be students and their families and their advocates standing up. It shouldn't just be bravery on their part. What is going on here? Nothing in this country happens by accident. Judge Clay, in his decision in the Detroit case, talked about how educational opportunity, like everything else in America, was racialized. Look, the inferior educational opportunities that are afforded children of color in Michigan and Detroit and throughout the country is one of the most effective racist policies that have ever been devised to attempt to degrade Black and Latinx and children of color's minds, to attempt to subordinate them, to attempt to disenfranchise their communities, to keep them out of the political system. I think it's important to recognize this. I think it's important to recognize that the choices that Detroit and Michigan have made are deliberate choices to ensure that certain communities are not part of our democracy. That's what public education was. That was the dream of public education, that it would be the opportunity to better one's circumstances. There is no democracy if there is not meaningful public education. And as Judge Clay said, you can trace this back to race. When the state of Michigan fought us in this case, they filed papers with a federal court saying that the problem was the intellectual limitations of the children. That's not my words. That's the words of the state of Michigan. When we won the victory in Judge Clay's decision, the Michigan legislature went to court and said it was too expensive to give children even a basic education. That's about race and that's about caste. And frankly, it is not just in the interest of the business community, it is in terms of the moral integrity of all individuals, including the business community, to say that's not our state. We don't accept that. This is, if we're to be truly anti-racist, we've got to make sure that all kids get the education that we would want for our kids.
Thank you. Well said, Mark. I really appreciate that. It seems like it's becoming even more difficult to help people really understand how structural racism is influencing how it shows up in systems, right? And we've seen, like in the last 5 or 6 years, a real push to help people understand how it shows up. But recently, there was an executive order that was issued by our president, who basically said that we could not address some of these issues with federal dollars. Helping people understand what structural racism is and how it influences the life outcomes of certain parts of our population. And when you add to that, we had proposals in both California and Michigan where we cannot distinguish or offer public policy that would help people based on gender or race. I'm just wondering, from your point, when you think about these issues and the developments across the country, how do we help the broader community who don't understand the experiences of these children, who may even stigmatize these children or count them out, as Mark just said, where the state said it's their intellectual capacity, rather than this system isn't meeting their needs. So I'm just wondering, right, how do you view this issue, and what's your take?
Well, I think, again, a great question. So one way of thinking about structural racism, and I sometimes refer to it as structural racialization, because when people think racism, they think there must be a racist. They think there must be a person who's intentionally doing something now. And sometimes that is the case, but oftentimes it's not. And it's really a distraction in the sense that we live in systems, and systems live in us. So an example would be, think about a sports metaphor, right? What are the rules of the game? Are the rules of the game fair? Not is the person cheating, not is the ref cheating. Are the rules of the game fair? And let's bring it home a little more closely in terms of our current situation. When we watched the life being squeezed out of George Floyd, with the police having his knee on his neck, one of the first questions is, did the police follow the rules? And whatever the answer is, we know there should not be a rule that will allow you to actually have your knee on someone's neck. We have several police departments across the country that still allow chokeholds. That's the rules of the game. And it's not saying necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily the police is bad. And what we saw with Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, breaking into her house in the middle of the night and shooting 20 bullets and killing her. And they come back with grand juries that the police did not break any rules. What they didn't examine is, what are the rules? What are the rules? How do we fund schools? How do we draw school districts? How do we train teachers? How do we pick curriculum? And so one reason it's important to be deliberately anti-racist is think about swimming. If you're swimming in a current and you're swimming against the current, the moment you stop swimming, you start going back down, moving with the current. And there's so many things in our society that move us in the wrong directions. There's so many structures in place that we feel like if we're going to change that, it takes a lot of work. We have to deliberately go against the structure until we change the structure. Now, in terms of President Trump's order, I know Mark is busy, but I'm hoping he's not too busy, because that's clearly a violation of the First Amendment. To say you can't teach students about race, you can't teach critical race theory. First of all, he doesn't know what it is. But secondly, he's getting from some source that it's anti-racist or it's anti-white. And we shouldn't use federal money for that. There's a whole litany of things in the First Amendment that says, no, the government cannot dictate content that way. And in a sense, is very divisive. Not only should people be learning about race and our history, they should be learning much more. They should be learning about these systems and structures and how they work. And that's not anti-white. That's not anti-American. That is what America is about. We are a country that's experimenting. We're learning. And to learn about anti-racism, and as we've already talked about, when you have a racialized system like Michigan, Black students don't do well, but neither do the white students. It actually drags everybody down. Not the same, but it drags everybody down. And Ross Chetty at Harvard has shown this over and over and over again, that when you have these systems that are deeply flawed, it acts the whole region, the whole community suffers. So there's really very clear legal questions being raised here, but there's also deep moral questions. Are we really going to be the United States? Are we going to be a country where all people are valued and all people are given a fair shot? And that's what really teaching about anti-racism and equally important, providing education system where you set a floor, where you say no students is allowed to drop below this level. I have 2 children. I would not send my children to schools in Detroit where there are rats and roaches. And I went to Detroit a few months ago before the pandemic, and there was a water alert saying, don't drink the water, especially in schools. What does that mean? How are you learning if you don't have heat, if you don't have water, if you're sharing, if the hose? No parent, if they had an option, would allow their child to go to such a school, and learning is not going on in those schools.
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. There's a level of humanity that we miss, particularly when we're in these racialized systems, and the way if our views are racialized. And to your point, it ends up burning everyone. And so, and everybody doesn't get a chance to feel like they fully are expressed or their experiences are shared. And so one of the things, Dannah, you talked about is how your education in high school, where you were actually able to interrogate the history of African Americans, interrogate African American texts, helped you kind of make meaning out of life and understand what you were going through and others were going through as students. So can you just talk a little bit about the importance of that? And if we were to end that, what would that mean for students like you and your siblings?
Yeah, definitely. This question really hits home because so in 10th grade, my history teacher, my world history teacher, he had one day we just came to class and he made us throw our books away. And we were like, "What's going on, Mr. Melvin?" And he passed out these pamphlets that were titled like Detroit history, and he started teaching us Detroit history midway through the semester. And and that experience really made me join Forward to Forward and start talking about advocacy and what does this mean. It was the first time in my life I had learned about Detroit history. And prior to that, I had watched documentaries, one titled A National Disgrace that talked about the education system in Detroit. And I was always aware of the stigma of being from Detroit. What does that mean? And it was always attached to being impoverished and being in poverty. But I never knew why. Like I didn't know why these things existed. Why was I seen this way? And on top of being a Black woman. And so yeah, we just learned Detroit history. And he went through, he wasn't even from Detroit, but he was like, you all need to know this. And then when I had switched schools, my English teacher had made it he became also our history teacher. And he made it an option for students to either take US AP history or Detroit history. And some students didn't qualify for AP history. I was the only student who qualified for AP history, but opted out of it and instead took Detroit history. And as the semester progressed, there are other students who opted out of AP and just switched to his class because the things that we were learning, and it just made more sense of like, why does my neighborhood look like this? And not just education, just the housing and the car industry. Like, what does it mean to be from a Motor City? What is the history behind it? And it really helped me when I entered spaces like the University of Michigan, or when I was just the only person, the only Detroiter. And like, when people came to me with those stereotypes, like, oh, Detroit's very dirty or very this. And I was like, actually, it's linked back to this. It's linked back to this situation, this, and I got a weight with, and I was able to combat those stereotypes and able to teach people, and also learn for myself what it meant to be from Detroit. But I am thinking about like, without that knowledge and without that education, and also what Mr. Mark was talking about the bravery from students, that kind of connected to the bravery from my teachers of creating that curriculum and also standing up against the administration who were really against it. And they were also very communicative to us on how they were against it. So and thinking like without that knowledge and opting out of US World History AP, it definitely shaped me into the activist I am today. And without that, I don't know how my experience would be, and also how my knowledge would be, and also where I would stand when it comes to education equity in the city of Detroit.
Yeah, well, it's so important, I think, to see yourself in history. And
Yeah.
quite honestly, for a lot of groups, not just African Americans, but lots of groups in our country, they don't see themselves in our history books. And they don't see themselves in the current context, which is part of like making it relevant and engaging for young people. And we have to do that. And we have to do more of that in the state. So, Mark, I wanted to ask you a quick question because I know we're running short on time. You talk a bit about this notion of basic rights versus privileged gifts. Can you just explain that for the audience?
Yes, you think about the things in America that you take for granted. We don't have to argue. We're not supposed to argue that you have a right to speak. We're not supposed to argue that you have a right to vote. But we're still fighting about whether you have a right even to a basic education itself. That should be off the table. The question should be, look, there are kids right now in Detroit. 30% of the kids in Detroit don't have access to the internet. They don't have access to an education. Nobody should be begging for that opportunity. It should be part and parcel of what it means to be an American. You know, Bob Moses, one of the great civil rights leaders in SNCC, often talks about education for children of color as sharecropper education. We go to school not just to learn the Pythagorean theorem or how to do chemistry experiments, but we go to school to find out who we are and to learn who we are. I love that Dannah talked about it as Detroit history, not Black history, but Detroit history. When we don't have education that says to children, you have the same opportunities, that's a given. And the question is how to perfect it, not whether or not it exists to begin with, like the state of Michigan argued against us throughout the litigation. When that happens, what you're saying to children is, here's what you're going to learn in school. You're going to learn you don't count. You're going to learn you're disposable. You're going to learn that you're not entitled to the same sort of opportunities as children in Grosse Pointe or Bloomfield Hills or Ann Arbor. John is exactly right. This isn't about achievement gaps. It's about opportunity and whether or not we're going to say as Americans, all individuals are as children to say that to have opportunities. We're going to be talking about whether or not we love all children as if they're own. And if every person who is listening to this today isn't saying what John said, I will be, I'm prepared to send my child to any school in the state of Michigan. If they're not prepared to do that, then they don't really believe that all children should have the same opportunity, and they don't really believe that all children are equal.
Thank you for that. So, John, we're close to the end, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what does it look like for our state to show that it's serious about equity. I do appreciate the comments you made about changing the rules because I often describe power as the ability to rewrite the rules, and we need some rewriting. There needs some serious editing and purging of what the rules were in our state to be effective. And so I'm curious from your vantage, how do you see what would be a substantive step forward for the state of Michigan?
Well, I think there are some things that are sort of low-hanging fruit. I mean, I think Mark's given us a goalpost. First of all, we need to have outcomes. I mean, you should be able to drink the water at school and at home, frankly. You should be able to be warm. You should have up-to-date textbooks. As Dannah said, you should be able to learn about the history of Detroit and your country. You should be able to have qualified teachers. You should be able to, part of the thing, but at the end of the day, we're concerned about the outcomes. And part of that is recognizing that every student counts. Now, Jefferson, great in many respects, flawed in many respects. But one of the things he got right, he said he was one of the architects of education in the United States, he and Dewey. And he believed that in order to make citizens, you needed education. You needed people to be able to take another person's perspective. That was from his perspective. You could only have democracy if you had education. And education was not just for citizens, it was actually teaching people to become citizens and productive members of society. So, in the short period of time I have, I can't be prescriptive, but we know there are counties around the country. Part of it is just to take this seriously and not make the excuse, like the legislators did, that these kids can't learn, that it's too expensive, that they don't count. We have to get that behind us. And then we can sort of talk about what's the best way to do it. And what's the best way to do it with everybody on deck, with parents, with teachers. And it might mean changing the way we draw school boundaries. It might mean changing the way we fund schools. It might mean changing the way we actually do housing. In Montgomery County, they've been very successful with schools, but they do it through housing. They build affordable housing in Montgomery County. It's the third richest county in the country. But they have about 20% of the housing is below market rate, and they have a substantial Black and Latino population. And they're aware that they're doing education through housing. So there are many different avenues, but you have to be clear on the value of students, of all students, and what is our goal.
Oh, thank you for that. And one of the things I've been saying most recently is that in this country, in the place we are today, the people who are pushing against the rules are young people. And Dannah, I will say this to you, is that we adults are standing on your shoulders and your peers' shoulders all across the country. And it's time for us to actually be the leaders you deserve. And to show you and show every student in this state, all 1.5 million of them, that the adults will not take their success, their possibilities, their opportunities for granted, that we will not make this a chance system. In closing, I just want to say how much I appreciate all three of you. Thank you, Mark, John, and Dannah. And I want to thank our guests for tuning in for the Detroit Regional Chamber Mackinac Policy Conference 20 conversations. Have a great day. And I hope you enjoyed the session and want to learn more.
The Detroit Regional Chamber's MPC20 Conversations, Respond and Rebuild digital series is provided in partnership with Detroit Public Television and presented by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, with additional support from Accenture, Bank of America, Barton Malow, Comerica Bank, Consumers Energy, Delta Dental, Dow, DTE Energy, Enbridge Energy, Ford Motor Company, Huntington Bank, ITC, KPMG, the Kresge Foundation, Kroger, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, PNC Bank, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, the Skillman Foundation, and TCF Bank. And by these supporters. Support for Detroit Public TV's coverage is provided by DTE Energy Foundation and Masco.